Welcome to Not2 Reads, an audio library of revolutionary texts. Scripting the Change. Selected writings of Anuradha Ghandy. A Pyrrhic Victory. Government Takeover of Empress Mills. More than a year after the state government's takeover of the Empress Mills, one of Vidarbha's oldest and largest industrial units, its future is still uncertain. The problems that led to the takeover are still smoldering, particularly with the retrenchment of over 4,000 workers. The crisis in the textile industry has affected units in all parts of the country, but Maharashtra and Gujarat are among the worst affected. Almost 127 mills around the country have closed down. More than 1 lakh textile workers in Maharashtra alone have been rendered unemployed due to retrenchment or closure. While large cities like Bombay and Ahmedabad are badly affected, smaller places like Nagpur have been the worst hit. In small towns and cities, where the textile unit has been a major source of employment, closure has meant a noticeable decline in the economy of the area. Mill owners have squarely put the responsibility of the decline and crisis in the textile industry on the unprofitable nature of the industry, the rapid proliferation of power looms, and the government's taxation policy. They claim that a vicious circle has been created with low profitability preventing reinvestment on modernization, resulting in the problem of obsolescent technology, further compounding the problem of high costs and low profits. On the other side, a closer look at this industry, India's oldest, reveals a situation in which rapacious mill owners reaped super profits from the mills and used this capital for speculation and diversification into other industries. These mills, drained of their profits, were left to run as best as they could. Having reached a state of stagnation, the downward slide began. Then, they were abandoned or were taken over by the government. In either case, the mill owners escaped with the minimum of liabilities. The big industrial houses began their entry into modern production with textiles and were able to build up their empires. The story of the Tatas is no different, and their saga started with the setting up of the Empress Mills in Nagpur. Empress Mills and the Tatas. Over a century ago, on 1 January 1877, Queen Victoria of Great Britain was proclaimed Empress of India, and on the same day, Jamshedi Tata's first company, named Empress Mills, as a token of devotion to the British Queen, was started. The company was floated with a nominal capital of 15 lakh rupees. This capital was raised from the profits earned from trade in opium and raw cotton for export, and from contracts with the Commissariat of the British Army when it attacked Iran in 1857 and Ethiopia in 1868. The location of the mill in Nagpur came by default, since the site in Jubalpur came to be occupied by a fakir's shrine who refused to vacate the spot. Nagpur was selected because it was the center of a handloom industry, was accessible to raw materials, markets, coal, water, etc., and also the terminus of the main railway line. 10 acres of marshy land was purchased from the Raja of Nagpur. Empress Mills started on a bitter note, since the inferior machinery purchased by Tata, coupled with a fire, resulted in the mill's shares falling in the market. The situation was redeemed with the purchase of new machinery, and, in 1881, after a period of 4 years, a dividend of 16% was paid. The mills saw tremendous expansion till 1922, and 4 mills were added to the original Mill No. 1, as also a cotton waste plant. A unit which had started with 10 acres had, in its possession, in 1927, 186 acres of land. It had a spindleage of 1,352 and 2,200 looms, apart from 480 spindles and 32 looms in the waste plant. The mill's integration with the cotton growing areas was very strong, and it had ginning and pressing factories throughout the old central provinces and Berar. It had its own agents for purchasing cotton in the central provinces, Berar, the Nizam territory, Punjab, Surat, Tarwar, and Coimbatore. The chief selling agents were the firm of Jamnalal Pardar and Company, a Marwari firm whose business connections with the Tatas dated back to the time of Jamshedji's father. The mills had 35 selling agents spread throughout India, including one at Rangoon, one of them managed by the firm of Jamnalal Pardar, whose efforts made the Empress trademark Nagchap a household phrase. The Tatas also came to own about 7,000 acres of land in various districts of Vidarbha, which were farmed till the 1960s. They lost all but 53 acres of land at Wardha under the Land Ceiling Act. The Tatas were not merely industrialists, but they were also major landowners and investors in real estate in the region. The Tatas undertook considerable welfare activities in the city and, particularly, in the areas where the workers lived. Several amenities were provided, and a large number of economic incentives were instituted to tie down the workers to the mills. A substantial amount of money was spent on educational institutions, particularly those run by the depressed classes mission society. The development of Indira and Pachpauli can be traced directly to the mills' housing schemes. This was done for ensuring a permanent labor force. An overwhelming number of workers were locals drawn from the surrounding villages, and a significant proportion of them were Mahars. The Tatas' perspective on these welfare activities can be seen from their director's report for 1887, which stated that, quote, "The creation of the said fund," this was with reference to the pension fund, "is in the interest of the shareholders, as securing faithful, continuous, and therefore efficient service on the part of each workpeople," end quote. The mill, which was inaugurated in 1877, had earned profits to the extent of 9.22 crore rupees, quote, which is nearly 61.47 times the original ordinary share capital, end quote, up to 30 June 1926, as the Silver Jubilee report of the mills points out. The extent of profits they made can be gauged from the fact that, during the Second World War, the company paid a tax of 1 crore rupees on the excess profits they earned on one single year. The mills were an extremely profitable unit and laid the foundation of the Tata Empire. To what extent and in what manner the mills played this role is difficult to pinpoint, but during the teething stage of Tisco, and in other difficult periods, the mills' funds were used to pay the salaries of the Tisco employees. By the end of the Second World War, the company had a cash reserve of 2 crore rupees, apart from other reserves. All these reserves were wiped out by the 1950s. The decline of the mills had begun. Record of mismanagement. During the 1950s, the company took a loan for demolishing the ramshackle buildings of Mills No. 1 and 2. Apart from costing 55 lakh rupees, the production had to be stopped and the workers laid off. This led to strikes and layoff compensation had to be paid to the workers. In 1970, the management conceived of the idea of diversifying in the form of a small paper mill. This unit came on stream only by 1975, by which time the investment had jumped from 50 lakh rupees to 1.65 crore rupees. The machinery which was procured developed cracks, leading to an additional expenditure of 40 lakh rupees. Over the years, the management has purchased machinery and then left it unused. An investment of 46 lakh rupees was made in diesel generators in 1975, when the state of Maharashtra had a power crisis. This was used only for 6 months. The same was the case with 700 motors purchased by the mills. In 1978, machinery worth 5 crore rupees was bought for the purpose of modernization and not used. While the company's sales have been declining with production being steady, the Rashtriya Mill, Mazdoor Sangh, RMMS, have alleged that the top management has become top-heavy with a high turnover rate. Seeing that the ship was sinking, many among the senior personnel obviously deserted the Empress Mills. In the notice for the closure of the mills, the Tatas emphasized the increase in prices of raw materials as the basic reason for their inability to run the mills. They cited the case of cotton prices, which increased from 6,200 rupees per candy in 1982 to 7,400 rupees in 1984. They have also emphasized the increase in prices of chemicals, dyes, coal, electricity, water charges, and the inflated wage bill, which they said was 35% of the total cost of production. The other reasons stated were recession in the market, growing consumer resistance, competition from power looms and hand looms, obsolete machinery, high loom labor ratio, and the declining demand for cotton textiles. The arguments given by the management for the sickness of Empress Mills have little to do with the objective problems of the industry and more to do with the deliberate neglect and mismanagement of the mills. These arguments are full of half-truths and misleading statements in order to cover up the management's role in the mill's sickness. Increase in prices is a common phenomenon, and the basic function of a management is to take this into account while planning its strategy. The public relations exercise on the inherent efficiency of the private sector rings false in the face of the role of the Tata management in running Empress Mills. The inflated wage bill cited by the management is misleading, since the wage bill has varied from 21% of the total cost of production in 1962 to 22% in 1982. The sharp increase in the wage bill as a proportion of the total cost of production in 1984 is more due to the lowering of the total output than due to any other factor. The management took this figure to show a general increase of the wage bill relative to the total production. The obsolescence of the machinery is nothing but the deliberate neglect by the management, since, until 1977, no investment was made in modernization except for the purchase of some automatic looms. After 1977, some piecemeal and haphazard modernization was introduced. There had been a deliberate and systematic effort to gradually bring down the production by the non-utilization of installed capacity and the refusal to employ any workforce as per the agreed complement. A part of the Russian order was met by buying cloth from the market rather than increasing production in the mills in 1985. The order made through Tata Exports Limited led to a loss since the company supplied cloth at a losing rate. The deal seems to have benefited Tata Exports more than Empress Mills. The RMMS has alleged that there has been systematic and deliberate indifference both in the purchasing of raw materials, particularly cotton, and the selling of the mill's products. The Empress Mills was made to buy Nelco computers, for which it did not have much use. Since 1962-3, the company has been making virtually no profits. Dividends were paid in 1973 and 1974 and have been nominal, ranging from 5 to 6%. The profits have also been marginal, ranging from 1 to 2% of the turnover. The cost of raw materials has been comparatively high, ranging from 50 to 60% of the turnover, and indicates a probable inflated bill in order to siphon off funds. Similarly, the commission charges for sales promotion show an increase from 0.8% of the turnover in 1962 to 2.3% in 1982. This is another established method for siphoning off funds from the mills. Since 1962, the company has been virtually functioning off borrowings. The borrowings, as a percentage of the total capital, have been surprisingly high, ranging from 75% to 85%, and have risen continuously from 490 lakh rupees in 1962 to 978 lakh rupees in 1982. In its closure notice, the company gave the profit and loss account to show the losses that had been accumulating. But a comparison with the original balance sheet shows that these profits and loss figures for the year 1982 and 1983 were wrong. For instance, while the original balance sheet for 1983 shows a profit of 34.37 lakh rupees, the profit and loss account submitted within the closure notice showed a loss of 498 lakh rupees for that year. In the 1980s, The company's position had worsened, and in August 1985, cotton was being procured on a monthly basis. In 1985, during Diwali, 2,000 workers were being paid without any production. Mill number 3 was closed in 1984. In February 1985, some changes in the local management were made in order to check the deterioration, and a loan was also being negotiated. On 8 February 1986, Barwat, the personnel manager, announced at a press conference that the mills had suffered a loss of 4 crore rupees in 1985 and was expected to lose 9 crore rupees in 1986. Production had come down to less than 10%. Not only had the mills been piling up losses, but the interest rates, which had by then piled up to 37 lakh rupees per month, had been mounting too. The press conference was called in order to announce the submission of a notice for closure to the state government. They were demanding permission for closing the mills from 5 May 1986. Tanta's solution and the takeover. An effort to tackle the problems of the Empress Mills was initiated in 1977, when Ratan Tata took over the chairmanship. A soft loan was obtained from the IDBI for machinery worth 5 crore rupees. In actual terms, this represents what has been spent in the last 50 years on modernization and resulted in piecemeal reforms when more drastic changes were required. Some moves were made to merge it with the other textile mills owned by the Tatas and to rationalize the product mix of the companies involved, but this was not seriously pursued by Bombay House, the headquarters of the Tatas. Ratan Tata worked out a rehabilitation scheme in which the workers seeking voluntary resignation would be paid 5,000 rupees apart from other dues. This scheme was accepted in principle by 1,000 workers, but the State Bank of India refused to sanction the 50 lakh rupees needed on the ground that it was not the bank's function to finance labor retrenchment. After this, the IDBI was approached for help, which proposed a rehabilitation package of 8.6 crore rupees, out of which 2.5 crore rupees would come from the Tatas. They also imposed certain other conditions, like the voluntary separation scheme and the foregoing of industry-wise wage increases by the workers. The scheme also expected the government to grant relief from sales and purchases taxes and an exemption from electricity dues. All schemes involved roughly 40 to 50% retrenchment of the workforce. It is doubtful whether this or any other rehabilitation scheme was pursued seriously by the Tata management. The management's much vaunted exercise of the IDBI rehabilitation scheme was a mere ploy to cover up their plans to abandon the mills. This is also obvious from the fact that the RMMS union alleged in its reply to the closure notice of the Tatas that the management never seriously discussed with the union the rationalization measures to be undertaken. This is to be seen in the context of the union's own admission of closely cooperating with the management in the various rationalization agreements signed by them over the years. As a corollary, the union has stated that this cooperation had cost them dearly, leading to a reduction of the workforce from 22,000 to 7,120. The credibility of the management's efforts at rehabilitating the mills is even lower, because in the previous years, they had not raised the finance to implement the schemes that they had already signed. Due to a paucity of funds, they continued to employ 60 workers who had reached superannuation. 40 workers who had been identified as surplus in a previous rationalization agreement had not been discharged, since the management did not have the funds to pay them their dues. The gratuity, provident fund, and family pension of many retired employees had not been paid. The Tatas let the Empress Mills drift, and when the crisis reached its peak, they quietly withdrew from a situation of their own making. The Empress Mills Ordinance, and its statement of objectives, says that the state government had made efforts to persuade the Tatas to resume operations by availing of the concessions granted by the IDBI, but it did not resolve from its attitude. On 7 February 1986, the Empress Mills submitted an application seeking the state government's permission for closing the mills from 5 May 1986. The government rejected the application, and the Tata management sought voluntary liquidation. Taking advantage of the workers' spontaneous agitation at the mill level, which began in April 1986, the Tata management suspended production from the end of April and declared a lockout from 3 May 1986. Circumventing the denial of permission for closure, the Tata management managed to close the gates of the Empress Mills from 3 May 1986. The Bombay High Court appointed a provisional liquidator on 14 May 1986, while the state government, under pressure from the workers' unions and from politicians, had to reluctantly agree to, quote, explore the possibilities of taking over the mills, end quote. The final solution to the Empress Mills issue came, after a period of 5 months, in the form of an ordinance for taking over the mills. Under Section 311, the ordinance vests the mills with the Maharashtra State Textile Corporation Limited. Although the textile industry is governed by the BIR Act, the ordinance has been enacted under the Industrial Disputes Act. Apparently, this has been done since there is no provision for takeover under the BIR Act. But, as a result of this, the employees are at a disadvantage, since the definition of an employee is different in the two acts, and hence the number of those eligible for retrenchment compensation under the Industrial Disputes Act will be less than those under the BIR Act. The ordinance makes no mention of the number of workers to be employed, but explicitly gives the power to the new management to reorganize and rationalize the mills, with or without modernization. This, coupled with the decision to adhere to the norms laid down by the Bombay Industries Textile Research Association, BITRA, sealed the fate of 40 to 50% of the workforce. The ordinance set an amount of 6.1 crore rupees to be paid as compensation to the management. But this amount was to be paid only after settling the liabilities of the mills. The ordinance also set out a priority list of creditors. The first priority was to be given to the workers' dues. The Tatas had valued their assets at 6.45 crore rupees, while a government-appointed committee comprising of members from the MSTC, IDBI, and other banks submitted a valuation of 1.22 crore rupees. But the state finance minister, Sushil Kumar Shinde, while submitting these facts on the floor of the State Assembly in Nagpur, 25 November 1986, blandly asserted that the government's decision to set aside 6.1 crore rupees was close to the Tata's own valuation rather than that of its own committee. Irrespective of this figure, the immediate actual liabilities in terms of dues, back wages to workers and employees, worked out to almost 10 crore rupees. Role of the RMMS. In the same speech, the minister also praised the Rashtriya Mill Mazdoor Sangh, RMMS, for conducting the agitation in, quote, a peaceful way, end quote, holding it up as an ideal to be emulated by other unions, which has apparently contributed to this solution. The passivity of the Empress Mills workers in the face of such a grave crisis under RMMS leadership is in marked contrast to their own earlier history. The second recorded strike in India's labor history was in the Empress Mills in 1877. The leadership of the workers was in the hands of the social reformers like Kisan Phaguji Bansod and Dunti Raji Tengdi. The workers were unionized for the first time in 1927 by Advocate Ruikar, a Congress socialist. Ruikar had opposed the formation of the Indian National Trade Union Congress, INTUC, in 1947, and had joined the EIMS in 1948. Ambedkar's Independent Labour Party also formed a union among the Empress workers in 1946. This merged with the INTUC in 1954. The CPI-affiliated Girni Kamgar Union, GKU, never gained effective strength, although they were powerful in the mills of western Vidarbha. Gradually, the INTUC became the main union in Nagpur's textile mills. Various important politicians of the region, like Vasant Sate, Narendra Tidke, and Bhagwantrao Gaikwad, began their career among the Empress Mills workers. Not only was the RMMS the sole recognized union for the industry in the region, but it also had strength in marked contrast to the situation in Bombay's mills. The RMMS leadership was well aware of the crisis in Empress Mills even before the closure notice came. The leadership, based in Bombay, had witnessed the closure of 13 mills in Bombay. In Empress Mills itself, earlier agreements had been breached, and the working of the mills had been reduced drastically. The union's only response was to petition the government and demand an inquiry into mismanagement. They made no efforts to launch an agitation. Hence, when the closure notice came, the RMMS had no real grounds to be surprised. They chose to respond primarily at the legal level. They filed a detailed reply pointing out the discrepancies and the deviousness of the Tatas in their notice. The RMMS did not mobilize the workers, nor did they present the grim situation before them. They constantly said that they were expecting their government, both at the central and at the state level, to intervene and find a solution. Threats of agitation, if any, were shadowboxing, as Haribhau Naik and others lobbied with the state government to take over the mills. Local Congress I politicians were in a state of panic. They saw that an abrupt closure of the mills would mean a decline in the future of not only the RMMS, but also of the Congress I itself. Except for a morcha and a jail paro program, the RMMS did not have any mass mobilization of the Empress Mills workers, nor did they enter into any joint front with other unions. They came together with other unions only on 1 October 1986, one day before the ordinance was issued by the state government. The Nagpur Union of Journalists tried to form a joint front of all the unions to agitate against the closure. Unions affiliated to the opposition parties came together and launched an agitation undertaking morchas, dharnas, and jail paro. By April 1985, when the workers realized the imminence of the closure, they spontaneously began agitations at the mill level. Rebel Congress I leaders also entered into the fray to win over the workers, while the RMMS continued to assure the workers that a solution was in the offing. The workers continued to support the RMMS because they hoped that its association with the ruling party would protect their interests. When the mill closed on 3 May 1986, no solution was yet in sight. The RMMS moved to the labor court demanding relief, but obtained none. The RMMS time and again, and in writing, had agreed to accept the Bitra norms for reorganization and rationalization. The leadership was obviously involved in finalizing the provisions of the ordinance. They had no objection to the workers contributing funds for the mills to run, and proposed a wage cut of 7% to 10% for this purpose. The state government accepted the figure of 10%. Hence, after the government had issued the ordinance, the RMMS had no real reason to challenge its provisions in the High Court. Expectedly, they lost the case, once again transferring their responsibility for the massive retrenchment that was coming on to the court. This is a repetition of the ploy they had employed during the closure of the mills. The High Court upheld the validity of the ordinance, including the provisions regarding the new management's power to rationalize and reorganize, without consulting the union. The mills reopened with a massively reduced workforce, employed under harsher conditions and with a wage cut. The disenchantment of the workers with the RMMS began, evident from the fact that for the first time, the workers attacked an RMMS Pandal when Mill No. 5 did not reopen in September 1987. Present situation. Even though the ordinance was issued on 2 October, on Gandhi Jayanti, by Shankara Chavan, in the presence of Prime Minister Rajiv Gandhi at Nagpur, Empress Mills was formally opened on 25 November 1986, after a gap of 7 months. But the situation is far from satisfactory for the workers. According to the Bitra report, out of a licensed capacity of 1,10,500 spindles and 2,140 looms, only 67,732 spindles and 754 looms, including automatic looms, in 3 shifts and 823 looms in 2 shifts should be worked. They recommended a staff of 3,578, inclusive of administrative staff, for this working capacity. The report suggested that the workable looms and the spindles from mill number 5 be shifted to mills number 1 and 3, in effect closing down mill number 5. The functioning of the mills for the last year has been most depressing. The mill has not been able to achieve 30% of its production capacity, and the stock of finished goods has increased from 1,308 bales at the time of the takeover to 3,034 bales at the end of October 1987. The mills have been producing 13 lakh meters of cloth in a month when the rated production capacity is 95,000 meters per day. The average monthly loss has been ranging from 5 lakh rupees to 20 lakh rupees. The case for takeover was that once the workforce is reduced to the desired non-machine ratio fixed as per the Bitra norms, the mill would become a viable unit. On the floor of the Legislative Council, 21 November 1987, Nagpur Assembly Session, the Minister of State for Industries stated that the Empress Mill had a labor strength of 5,569 workers before the takeover, 2,797 workers had been reemployed, while the remaining 491 would be reemployed in stages. 320 workers had retired before the takeover, and 1,682 workers had sought voluntary retirement. 279 workers were surplus and would be paid their dues. The State Labor Minister also announced that 4.42 crore rupees had been paid to the employees who had sought retirement, while the dues of others have yet to be paid. The Chief Minister had stated at the time of issuing the ordinance that the mill would take 3 years to function normally. The RMMS had posed the Empress Mill issue in the form of a state takeover as the only solution, and claimed to organize a peaceful agitation to pressure the government to acquire the mill. Subsequently, when the ordinance was announced, the RMMS claimed it as their victory and a general vindication of their stand. But in retrospect, one could see that some form of takeover, possibly at the worst possible terms for the workers, was inevitable, irrespective of the RMMS agitation and the context of Vidarbha's backwardness, the effect of the mill's closure on Nagpur's economy, and the Congress I political fortunes in the city. The ordinance, in that sense, was the lowest common denominator for achieving this dual purpose of formally running the mills at the least possible cost and investment to the state. The AITUC, All India Trade Union Congress, and other union leaders thought that the closure notice was only a threat, that the Tatas wanted to go in for massive retrenchment and for large-scale modernization. Many unionists believed that the Tatas, for sentimental reasons at least, would not abandon their mother company. The RMMS had seen the writing on the wall, and they chose to stay passive. A tough public posture, coupled with passivity, was the tactic they employed in order to survive. The functioning of the RMMS over these years, their reasonableness, and their close cooperation with the management was harmful, not only to the interest of the workers, but also for the mills. An active, militant workforce keeps the management on its toes, keeps productivity rising. Paradoxical though it may seem, the cooperativeness of the RMMS with the management allowed the management to wallow in the complacency of its past record, of having to run the mill for so many years without any modernization or upgrading of production techniques. Consequently, it is not the Tatas or the Congress I who have lost. The Tatas have already made crores of rupees and now have got rid of a liability. On looking back, it is evident that the Tatas had decided to let the Empress Mill die, and an exercise of getting an IDBI loan was a mere decoy to mislead the workers. The Congress I and their unions have managed to survive so far. It is the workers who have lost everything. Thousands of workers are unemployed and have no hope of getting their jobs back. The number of rickshaw pullers, Vegetable sellers and other petty vendors have noticeably increased in the working areas of the city. They have taken their dues and returned to agricultural operations in the village or started small businesses, adding to the oversaturated informal urban economy. In spite of the chief minister's assurance, it appears very unlikely that the Empress Mill will ever function normally again. Local opinion in Nagpur is very pessimistic about the mill's future. It is being said that the central government has sanctioned a loan of 25 crore rupees, but it is not reflected in the mill's workings. The collapse of the mill is a major step in the economic decline of Nagpur. The whole course of events shows the impunity with which India's leading industrialists can circumvent labor laws designed to protect labor and abandon an industry they have sucked dry. They have been able to get away with little or no liability, primarily due to the connivance of the state government and its protege trade union. Empress Mills. What misstatements? Naval Tata has given a lengthy rejoinder to our article on the Empress Mills. The rejoinder, surprisingly enough, while eloquently championing the cause of the employer's rights, does not throw any fresh light on the issues and problem of the Empress Mills. In the process of criticizing our article, Naval Tata has digressed to the question of the sacrosanct right of the employers to close down their sick units. But the demand for the free exercise of this right should be seen in the context of the Indian industrialists using institutional finance belonging to the country, to which workers as citizens also contribute. This finance has been used by these industrialists to build up their industrial houses, rake in profits, thus, de facto, making this public finance their own private property. Why should we call this but corporate highway robbery? As late as 1978, the Tata management of the Empress Mills took a loan of 5 crore rupees from the IDBI. The machinery they bought with this finance was largely unutilized, as our article pointed out. Having misused such large sums of public money, does the management have no social responsibility? Today, India's big business houses have to their credit more than 4,000 crore rupees of unpaid loans. And yet, they demand the unfettered right to closure. To alleviate the sufferings of the retrenched workers, Naval Tata has suggested a national rehabilitation fund, partially funded by the workers themselves. This approach evades the basic cause of retrenchment and unemployment, a point to which we will return later. Additionally, it is important to note that to theoretically propound such a scheme is one thing, but its actual implementation is an altogether different matter. Even in the case of the Empress Mills, the Tata management flouted the rules guaranteeing the workers their statutory dues of provident funds. It was only in December 1986, after a case was registered at the Ganeshpeth police station under sections 406 and 34 of the IPC, against the board of directors, including Naval Tata himself, on the basis of a complaint registered by the Office of the Regional Commissioner of Provident Fund, that the management deposited the required sum. When such is the situation with the Tatas, a hallowed industrial house in India, one does not require much imagination to perceive the fate of the All India scheme mooted by Naval Tata. Tata accuses us primarily on 3 counts. Firstly, that we have not taken the question of economic viability into account. Secondly, that we have made misstatements. And thirdly, that ignoring the crisis in the whole textile industry, we have singled out the Tatas for this ignominy. It appears that he has not read our report carefully. We do not claim that any capitalist can run an industrial unit which is not viable. The economics of the cotton textile industry may not be as favorable as it once was. But it is our strong contention that the Empress Mills became unviable due to sheer and deliberate neglect by the Tata management and the siphoning off of funds leading to the tardy updating of technology and process. Hence, the central point is not the historical inevitability of the sickness of old units, but the role of specific economic and political forces in the decline of the viability of the concerned unit. Naval Tanta states that we have made misstatements. According to him, our first alleged misstatement is the mentioning of the Empress Mills workforce as being 22,000 at one point of time. But in his very own next statement, Tanta cites the same figure to prove the tyranny of the militant trade unionist Ruikar in the Empress Mills. Surab Bativala acquiesced to a work complement of 22,000. Then how does our figure become a misstatement? Our point that Ratan Tanta's claims of negotiating an IDBI loan were only a decoy to fool the workers is considered to be another misstatement by Naval Tanta. But this is the conviction of a large number of workers. In the final year of the crisis, the Tata management never made their plans publicly clear. Hence, workers remained in the dark about the type and extent of modernization, the extent of retrenchment and related issues, and the probability of obtaining the IDBI loan. This state of confusion suited both the management and the RMMS. Even if we assume that Ratan Tata made serious efforts in the final throes of the crisis, this does not condone the several decades of neglect and mismanagement. Tanta's third point is that we have ignored the overall crisis in the textile industry. If he had read our report carefully, he would have noticed that in our introductory paragraphs, we have mentioned the crisis in the cotton textile industry. The point that we could not cover is that of the growth and changes in the textile industry and its relation to the present crisis in the industry. The first important reason for the sickness and closure of cotton mills around the country was the draining out of profits by the managements. The second important reason was the entry of polyester in the textile world. The liberal import of man-made fibers, the encouragement given to this by the central government, even in the latest budget policy, has led to the phenomenal growth of Reliance and similar companies. This shows that not all sections of the textile industry are facing the crisis. A certain pattern of growth has been decided, in which priority has been given to man-made fibers and capital-intensive technology, and this has, consequently, benefited a section of the mill owners. All serious studies of India's economy have pointed out the suicidal nature of this pattern of growth, in which small islands of high technology will survive and thrive, surrounded by an ocean of backward, stagnant industry and agriculture. India's leading industrialists have supported and gained from this pattern of growth, at the cost of lakhs of workers who have suffered unemployment and increasing disparities. And this growth has been financed, partially at least, from the funds siphoned off from the older units. However, this is a subject for a lengthy study, which our report of the Empress Mills could not cover. Naval Tanta refuses to take responsibility for providing employment to the lakhs being born every year. According to him, the solution lies in agriculture, agroeconomics, small-scale industries, and self-employment. But elementary laws of economics tell us that small-scale production with low technology cannot survive in the face of competition from large-scale, high-technology industries. Therefore, while the Tantas continue to expand and reap their crores by moving from one profitable sector to another, abandoning the older, less profitable ones, in the scheme of things, it is the workers who must adjust to the problems of low wages, retrenchment, and unemployment. This policy of economic growth is not the creation of the government alone. Naval Tanta now cannot shrug off the industrialists' share of the responsibility for this pattern of growth, from their position in the commanding heights of our economy. With regard to Patel's comments, it is not our central thesis that the absence of militant trade unionism is fundamentally responsible for the economic unviability of the mills. Any such impression was unwitting. We do agree that for a meaningful understanding, it is necessary to place the Empress Mills in the context of the changes taking place in the Indian economy and, particularly, the role of foreign capital in nurturing the man-made fiber industry. This rejoinder will hopefully clarify his point. Regarding the other points in his letter, we feel that they were not within the scope of our article.